As H.P. Lovecraft once famously said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. So it makes sense that one of the oldest genres of movie is horror movies. While they probably weren't really called that back then, it would stand to reason that some of the first examples of cinema that we have are horror related. In the early days of cinema, they didn't have the capability of recording sound, and so films were recorded without sound, and music was added in later, generally speaking played live at the theaters that the movies were viewed in. Today, many of the silent movies that you see will have this music overlaid, but despite not having any sound, these movies are oftentimes way more terrifying than even a lot of its modern counterparts are. I think there are a few reasons for that, but in order to highlight these reasons, I would like to focus on 3 of the most famous silent horror movies. Now, I say 3 of the most famous. 2 of these are really famous, and one of them is not as famous. But these will be Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau in 1922, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1921. The third one is Thomas Edison's 1915 version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. At this point, Nosferatu is considered a classic, and it is one of the most recognizable horror movies ever. Even if you've never heard of the movie, I guarantee you have seen pictures of Max Schreck as Count Orlok. And it's a very, very terrifying creature design that highlights the vampire as somewhat of a creature, a monster, some kind of beast, rather than a very human-looking creature as it is often described in more modern folklore. This movie was made in 1922 by German director F.W. Murnau and produced by the German studio Prana Films, which was defunct after this movie was made. But the film studio was founded by a member of the occult, and they hoped to produce scary and occult-based movies. As is the case with many of these silent films, there's not much behind-the-scenes information. We do know the actors' names, but for now, all that we need to know is that the guy who played the vampire is named Max Schreck. Schreck plays Count Orlok, who is supposed to be kind of the Dracula figure of this movie. Little side note, but this is pretty well-known information. This movie is an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it is the first surviving copy of a film based around Bram Stoker's work. The movie studio claimed otherwise to avoid lawsuits, but were sued by Stoker's wife anyway, and the movie was largely put out of production, and all the copies were ordered to be destroyed. However, many survived, and we're able to watch this brilliant film today. This film is a masterclass in silent horror. It manages to creep you out beyond belief by simply the things it shows you. The music has something to do with it, but I believe it's more down to the cinematography of the film that allows for the creep factors to really come in. There's actual old abandoned German buildings, an actual castle, and Count Orlok's costume design is off-putting, and Max Schreck's performance as Count Orlok is off-putting as it is. I have talked about this movie so out of order, just sitting here rambling in my room, so I'm going to try to cut this into the order that it's supposed to be, but if this seems disjointed, I am terribly sorry. The real meat of the movie begins when Hutter goes to Count Orlok's castle in order to sell him a plot of real estate on which is an old decrepit castle or abbey, and this happens to be right across from where Hutter's wife lives. Hutter and his wife live. And this obviously becomes a problem later. Hutter, who would be the Jonathan Harker character, if you're familiar with Dracula's story, goes to Count Orlok's castle, and at night he can't sleep, so he gets up and he opens the door and sees Orlok staring at him from a room away. And there's kind of a dissolve shot that goes into a close-up of Orlok, but even before that shot, the up-close shot of him just staring at him, it's rather creepy when you see just the way he looks standing there at a distance. And then in horror, Hutter runs to his bed, tries to go to sleep, hides under the covers, and Orlok steps into his room, and you see his shadow cowering over Hutter with his arms up like this. And at this exact moment, his wife, Hutter's wife, who is a long ways away, sits up in her bed and sees him and calls out for her husband before she passes out. Perhaps if I knew more about the occult, there would be some kind of tie-in with that whole occult thing there. But it just seems that there's this connection between the two lovers, and they can feel each other's emotions in the moment, and she could feel in the moment that Hutter was scared, and she reached out to comfort him in the moment. Hutter survives this, and the next day he goes exploring the castle, and this is when he finds Orlok in his tomb sleeping for the night, or for the day. And he's so freaked out by this that he runs away. Later on you see Orlok putting coffins of dirt onto a carriage, and he climbs into one and levitates with his mind the lid up onto him and closes it, and the thing drives away. So Orlok's carriage drives away, and Hutter is left in the castle. We now see Count Orlok on a ship, and we see the fright that the sailors have over something they have found on the ship. And a few times Orlok appears to them. Once is a double exposure where he is seen translucently sitting on one of the boxes, and this frightens one of the sailors, and they abandon the ship. Another time, and this is the classic moment of the movie, the sailor sees a bunch of rats, and he begins to try to chop them up with an axe, and in doing this he awakens Orlok, and Orlok stands straight up out of his coffin, and it's one of the most frightening moments in cinema, and it is truly a great shot. It was kind of paid homage to in 1978's Halloween, when Michael Myers sits straight up. However, Michael Myers is sitting straight up. Count Orlok stands all the way up, from laying down all the way straight up without bending his knees or moving anything else other than his entire body. After this, we see the ship's captain tying himself to his wheel. He has no one else on the ship, and we see that Orlok is stalking him. Meanwhile, back in the town where Hutter is from, a plague has broken out, and lots of people are dying. There is a fantastic shot of the funeral parade through the street, on which there's about 5 or 6 coffins, and all of the townspeople acting as pallbearers and walking them to the cemetery. At some point during this, either before or after the plague scene, there's a shot of Orlok on a boat floating up to his newly purchased home that he plans on fixing up. However, we know he really just needs a place to stay in order to wreak his havoc upon the town. After this plague scene, there's a shot of Orlok looking over at Hutter's wife's room from his castle, and it's one of the best shots in horror cinema. Actually, this entire movie has some of the best shots in horror cinema. The movie ends when Hutter's wife learns that a vampire can be distracted by a beautiful woman. So she steps out to his balcony to lure him over to her late at night. And he comes over to her house in a very iconic stairway sequence where all you see is Orlok's shadow, and it would appear that he is in the form of a shadow in this moment because there is no physical Orlok anywhere close. He goes into the room and bites her neck, but as he does so, the sun comes up, he steps back into the sunlight and fades away. And that is the death of Count Orlok and the end of Nosferatu. This movie is influential, this movie is a classic, and without this movie we would never have gotten any of the Universal horror movies, which means we would have never gotten any of the slasher films, which means we wouldn't have ever gotten any of the Grindhouse films, which means that almost all of modern horror would not exist without this film. But before Nosferatu, there was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, starring Conrad Veidt and some guy named Krauss as the titular character Caligari, and Veidt playing Caesar, the somnambulist of the movie and main character. This film is one of the first ever horror films, and subsequently one of the first ever psychological films. We would never have had things like Shutter Island if it wasn't for this movie. It begins with a man telling him his sad story about how he has left his family and all of this stuff. And then he begins to tell the story of Dr. Caligari and his cabinet. Dr. Caligari works at a circus sideshow, and he has what he claims to be a somnambulist. I'll provide a definition of a somnambulist somewhere. It's not necessarily important for the movie, other than that he's under the control of Caligari. It's someone who he awakens and makes go to sleep. His name is Caesar, and the film begins with someone mocking Dr. Caligari, and then that night that man is stabbed to death in his bed. We then see the circus sideshow, and someone asks Caesar after Caligari awakens the somnambulist, "How long shall I live?" To which Caesar replies, "You will die at dawn." This man is horrified by this, and despite his best intentions, the man's dead at dawn. You see, Caligari was made during the time of German Expressionism, and this means that the art style of the film is extremely fantastical. Almost every shadow and every light is painted on rather than physically there. All of the sets are made up of just this non-Euclidean geometry, and it's a look that would inspire future directors such as Tim Burton. So we have this film to thank for everything Tim Burton ever did. The look of this film is extremely wild, and honestly 90% of the time I cannot tell what I'm looking at. But basically the story follows Caesar, the somnambulist, as he kills people under the influence of Dr. Caligari's hypnotism. When he goes to kill a girl, however, he ends up scooping her up and running across the rooftops. Bear with me, it has been a long time since I've seen this film. I wish only to really talk about the atmosphere of it, not so much the plot. You can watch this film for yourself on YouTube or on Tubi for free. The film basically ends where we find out that the man sitting on the park bench talking to the other man at the beginning of the film are actually two men in an sanitarium, and Dr. Caligari is actually the head doctor of the sanitarium, and all of the characters in the story are there in the courtyard with all the other patients at the insane asylum. I read that this was actually a plot twist that was forced on by the studio producers, and this would make sense because the opening and closing scenes are kind of out of junction with the rest of the film. However, I think it is still a fantastic twist. This film is influential because of the way it looks and because of its twist. That twist is something that has been driven into the ground to the point of it's just cliche. It would make me mad if I saw it in a movie at this point. The atmosphere is unlike anything I've ever seen. The film is legitimately creepy at times, and the set design is phenomenal. It's expressionistic. Expressionism is something that would be used in Nosferatu and Frankenstein later on. However, if you were using some kind of filter and you only had it turned up to like maybe 35 or 40 for, you know, Frankenstein and Nosferatu, it's turned all the way up to 100 for this film. Half the time you cannot tell what you're looking at. This could be partly due to poor image quality in the modern day after so many restorations of the film, but many of the things you're looking at, it would legitimately take you a second to figure out that it was a building, or that it was a street, or that that was supposed to be some kind of window. Like, some windows are just straight up triangles, some of them are just not even that kind of a shape, it's some kind of complex geometric shape. Many of the buildings are that way too. In the rooftop sequence where they are chasing Caesar through the streets and over the rooftops and everything, the first time I saw it, I legitimately didn't know what I was looking at. I just knew he was running away on something. I would love to see kind of a modern adaptation of this where they do a similar thing with the set design, but with better film quality so I can tell what's going on, and maybe turn it down just a little bit because, my God, it is impossible to tell what's happening half the time. This isn't a detractor, though. This film is really good, and I really love the atmosphere of it. Some of the imagery is stellar, and it's just iconic in horror cinema, and so influential. Almost every horror film owes a debt of gratitude to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Finally, we come to the Thomas Edison-produced 1910 film that is 10 years before the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Frankenstein. This is the first on-screen adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, and it came almost 100 years after she had published it. Self-described as a liberal adaptation which takes many things away from the novel, it is still probably the most accurate Frankenstein film to date, as far as what's in it being close to the book. The final act is pretty different, but the first half of the film is extremely close to the story itself, particularly on the creation of the creature and Frankenstein's reaction to that. The film was long considered lost. I mean, it's over 120 years old at this point, and many of its actors went uncredited for a long time. However, I will list the names of the actors here, lest they be forgotten. The film follows Dr. Frankenstein as he goes off to college, and his pursuit for the elixir of life leads him to create a monster which torments him, and in the end, in a fantastic moment, Dr. Frankenstein looks into the mirror and sees the monster and not himself, implying that he himself was the monster. It's done rather clunkily, but the film was sped up to 24 frames per second as a modern showings of it, and so it moves quicker than it would have back then when it was only shown at 16 feet per second. Movies moved slower back then, and that is why lots of these silent movies have this eeriness to them, because they all kind of move a little fast and disgruntled, and there's weird cuts and things like that. These wouldn't have been so apparent back in the day when films were hand cranked and it went slower. You can watch the Edison-produced Frankenstein on YouTube for free. It is approximately between 12 and 15 minutes long. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. However, the creature design in this film is actually rather scary. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be scared by this. Actually, there is actually a pretty scary scene. When Frankenstein first makes the monster, he's terrified and he runs into his room and he hides under his sheets. And he's got one of those old beds that's got like all the curtains all around it. And he looks up and he sees the monster peering in at him, which is a scene straight from Mary Shelley's book, and probably one of the scariest scenes from Mary Shelley's book. It's a lost relic, and it's only going to take up about 15 minutes of your time, so I highly recommend that you watch this. It's rather interesting to see, and image quality is actually okay for something that's 122 years old. It's very different from any other adaptation of Frankenstein that you have seen. However, I would say that the classic look took something from this film, because there's a certain square aspect to his head, even though he has this weird frizzy mane kind of thing. The creature design is very strange, and very odd choices were made there. However, it's a good film, I would say. Just honestly, it's just kind of, it's cool to see. And the studio itself said that they tried to take away anything that would be too horrific and grotesque for modern studio audiences, because at the time, in 1910, but because at the time all anyone knew was the Frankenstein novel, and they knew how disturbing and dark that novel was, and they were like, they're going to make that into a moving picture, and it was made into a moving picture. And the creation of the monster scene is kind of unsettling, I would say that. Perhaps the version I saw had incorrect music with it and was intentionally put creepier music with it than actually was in there. However, there's no way to be sure of that. I just know that the creation scene was a little creepy. Now, I'd like to speak to something that I mentioned briefly a second ago, and it's the way that we view silent movies now in the modern era. These films are all at least 100 years old, if not 120 or 122 years old. So we are viewing them so far removed from when they were released, everyone in them is dead. Oftentimes different music is paired with it than what it was originally meant to have, so there's a bit of a disjoint there. The films are shown at faster speeds than they were meant to be shown, at least frames per second, and that just creates this kind of fast-forward effect that a lot of silent movies are notoriously have, where people move too fast, things like this. And this even creates this effect of this kind of uncanny movement and the way the characters look. Particularly Frankenstein's monster in the 1910 version looks nothing close to human, and Max Schreck looks not quite human either, and that creates that uncanny valley effect, which is so effective in horror even today. But when paired with the uncanny movements of the incorrect film speed and this eerie music that probably wasn't meant to go along with it, as well as just this being so far removed from it, something about silent horror movies makes them scarier than the original sound movies. Some of this might have to do with the fact that they weren't held down by certain kind of codes. None of these movies, except for Frankenstein, were made, which is the least scary of the two I've talked about, were made in America. They were made in Germany. And this was a time in Germany, think about it, Caligari and Nosferatu. This is the 1920s in Germany. This is post-World War I, pre-World War II. However, there's lots of anti-Jewish sentiment, specifically in Nosferatu, as some people might say. They say that Count Orlok is a caricature of the Jews, and it's about the fear of the other, and it's just an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic film. I don't see it in such a way. However, I don't deny that this is a possibility. I just don't think of it that way. I think of it as just a horror movie. But it could be taken that way, and with that, there's a sort of horror of the past and the horrors of what became of the Jewish people later in the Holocaust. Caligari does not have such racist implications, however, it was made during the same time, and there is sort of the fear of Caligari as maybe some kind of Jewish caricature, but I'm not sure. I think this sort of uncanniness is what makes these movies so creepy even today, and what has made them have a lasting legacy. However, it's not just down to all these little quirks that probably weren't there when it was originally watched. These were horror films even when they were originally came out, so this means that they were scary back then. And that's why they're influential today. These films on their own are frightening, and the cinematography and the expressionism that comes out in all of these films is phenomenal and has carried on into today. I hope you enjoyed this look at old horror films, and I'll catch you in the next one.